The laughter started before she even sat down. It was the kind of laughter that wasn't meant to be hidden. The kind that travels across a room slowly, deliberately, like smoke finding its way under a closed door. Low at first, then louder, then pointed, like a finger aimed directly at something that wasn't supposed to be there. And she stood perfectly still. Her name was Naledi Abra. She was tall, sharp-featured, and composed in the way that only people who have survived many rooms like this one know how to be. Her skin was deep brown, smooth as polished mahogany, and her eyes held a calm that looked almost unsettling in a space as tense as this one. She wore a plain black blazer over a dark blouse, no jewelry except a single thin bracelet on her left wrist. Her locks were pulled back, and her posture was straight, not stiff, but deliberately upright, the way a person stands when they have decided not to shrink for anyone. She had been born in Botswana, raised between Gaborone and Johannesburg, and had lived in Seoul for the past 6 years. She spoke 4 languages without an accent that slowed her down. She knew numbers the way musicians know notes. And she had spent the last decade building, breaking, and rebuilding things that most people in this room couldn't even spell correctly on paper. But nobody in this room knew that yet. What they saw was a black woman standing beside a man they all feared. And to most of them, that made no sense at all. The man she stood beside was named Sean Hyuk-yoon. He was 32 years old, which surprised most people who met him for the first time. He didn't carry himself like someone who was still young. He carried himself like someone who had decided, very early in life, that age was irrelevant, that what mattered was clarity, patience, and the ability to see 3 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. Seon Hyuk was not tall, but he occupied space in a way that tall people often don't. He dressed simply, a charcoal suit, no tie, dark shoes that made no sound on the marble floor. His face was lean and angular, his eyes dark and expressionless, his hair cut short and neat. He wore no rings. No chains. No watches that announced wealth the way some men in his world felt the need to do. He didn't need to announce anything. Everyone in Seoul's underground already knew the name Seon Hyuk-yoon. He had built his operation from the ground up, starting at 22 in a city that had laughed at him the same way this room was now laughing at Naledi. He had turned that laughter into fuel. And 10 years later, his name sat at the top of a network that stretched from Seoul to Busan to parts of Southeast Asia and, in the last 3 years, into Africa, specifically through connections that Naledi herself had helped him build. But the men seated around this table tonight did not know the full picture. They knew Seon Hyuk. They respected Seon Hyuk. They feared what Seon Hyuk could do with a single phone call. But they had never been told about Naledi. And that, as they were about to discover, was the most expensive mistake of the evening. The room itself was private, the kind that doesn't appear on any building directory. It was on the 14th floor of a building in Gangnam, accessed through an elevator that required a key card and a code that changed every 48 hours. The walls were dark paneling. The table was long, black, and wide enough to seat 12. Tonight, there were 9 men seated, and Seon Hyuk standing at the head of the table with Naledi beside him. The 9 men represented various interests, suppliers, distributors, regional managers, and 2 men who ran logistics networks in South Korea and Japan respectively. They had been called here to discuss the restructuring of a major trade route that had recently been compromised. Money was at stake. Territory was at stake. And reputations, as always, were very much at stake. This was not a dinner party. This was a business meeting where the wrong answer could cost more than money. But when Seon Hyuk walked in with Naledi standing beside him, the professionalism in the room cracked slightly, like ice forming a hairline fracture before it gives way entirely. The man had expected his usual team, his senior advisor, Kwon Hyun-soo, a man in his 50s who rarely spoke but whose silence was respected. They had expected perhaps 2 or 3 of Seon Hyuk's known lieutenants. They had not expected a black woman dressed in a plain blazer who said nothing as she walked in and stood with the stillness of someone waiting for a bus. The first man to speak was Park Da-hoon. He was the oldest in the room at 57, heavyset, with a reputation for saying out loud what others only whispered. He sat near the middle of the table, his arms crossed, and he studied Naledi with open curiosity that quickly curdled into something less polite. "Who is she?" he asked, directing the question not at Naledi, but at Seon Hyuk. Seon Hyuk sat down slowly. He did not answer immediately. He poured himself a small glass of water, set the pitcher down, and looked at Da-hoon with an expression that gave nothing away. "She's here," he said simply. That was all. Da-hoon exchanged a glance with the man to his left, a younger man named Choi Sung-woo, who managed distribution across the southern ports. Sung-woo raised an eyebrow. Then he looked at Naledi the way someone looks at an object that has been placed in the wrong room. "Is she a translator?" Sung-woo asked. "The meeting is in Korean," another man pointed out. "Why would we need?" "She's fine where she is," Seon Hyuk said, cutting the murmur off cleanly. "Let's begin." A beat of silence. Then the men settled, shuffling papers and pulling out their phones to reference documents. But the discomfort didn't leave. It sat in the room like a third presence, watching. And Naledi stood beside Sean Hyuk's chair, her hands folded in front of her, her face unreadable, her eyes moving slowly over the table with the quiet attention of someone reading a page they had already memorized. The meeting began. For the first 15 minutes, it went the way these meetings usually went. Reports were given. Numbers were read. Routes were discussed in careful, coded language that sounded to an outsider like a logistics briefing but was really a very detailed map of how illegal goods moved from one country's coast to another. Naledi listened. She did not write anything down. She did not pull out a phone. She simply listened, and her eyes tracked each speaker with the focused attention of someone who processes information differently than most people, not collecting it, but organizing it in real time, fitting pieces together into a picture that others hadn't yet fully drawn. But the men at the table were not watching her listen. They were watching her stand, and they didn't like it. It was Dahun who broke first. He had been watching her from the corner of his eye since the meeting began, growing more irritated with each passing minute, not because she had done anything, but because she was there at all, and no one had told him why, and in his world, unexplained things were dangerous things. He put down his pen. "I'm sorry," he said, looking directly at Naledi now, his voice carrying clearly across the table. "But this meeting involves sensitive matters. It's not something for..." He paused, letting the pause do the work that more direct words might have gotten him in trouble for. "Everyone." Several heads turned. Naledi looked at him steadily. She did not react the way he probably expected, no flash of anger, no hurt expression, no visible shift in her posture. She simply looked at him the way you might look at a math problem you've already solved, waiting to see if the person still working on it would eventually arrive at the right answer. Dahun interpreted her calm as confirmation that she hadn't fully understood him. He tried again, this time with less subtlety. "This is a private discussion," he said. "For people with a seat at this table." The implication was loud. He hadn't said what he meant, exactly, but everyone in the room heard it perfectly. A few of the other men shifted in their seats. Some looked down at their papers. One cleared his throat softly. Not because they disagreed, but because they were watching to see how this would land with Seon Hyuk. And Seon Hyuk did not move. He sat with his elbow on the armrest of his chair, two fingers resting lightly against his jaw, and he looked at Dahun with those empty, patient eyes of his and said absolutely nothing. That silence was louder than anything Dahun had said. But Dahun, emboldened by the lack of correction, pressed further. "She doesn't even have a seat," he pointed out to the table, gesturing slightly toward Naledi with an open hand. "She's standing. Like someone who came in with the wrong floor." Scattered, uncomfortable laughter moved around the table. Not from everyone. Two men, seated further from Dahun, did not laugh. They watched Seon Hyuk carefully, reading the room the way survivors learn to do. But the others, 3 or 4 of them, allowed themselves the small satisfaction of the joke, smiling or chuckling quietly into their water glasses. And still Seon Hyuk said nothing. That was the part that confused his own men. The two seated near the door, Seon Hyuk's personal security, who had been in his service for years, exchanged a glance. They had never seen him allow disrespect in any form to go unaddressed for this long. The longer he stayed quiet, the more unsettled they became. It was like watching a clock that had stopped ticking and not knowing if it was broken or simply being held deliberately still. Naledi, for her part, turned her gaze away from Dahun and toward the window at the far end of the room. Seoul's night skyline sat in the glass like a painting, bright towers and slow-moving streams of light far below. She looked at it for 2 seconds. Then she looked back at the table. She was not going to leave. And she was not going to argue. She simply remained exactly where she was, and that stillness was more unsettling to the room than any response she could have given. The meeting continued, but the air had changed. Dahun had not gotten the reaction he wanted, and that made him louder. He returned to the agenda but carried a new edge in his voice, one that surfaced every time he glanced at Naledi. His language grew sharper. His posture more expansive, the way some men get when they feel they've established dominance and want to maintain it. The discussion had moved to a specific trade route, a maritime corridor that ran from a port in East Africa through the Strait of Malacca and into South Korea's southern coast. Recently, a shipment had been lost. Not stolen, lost, which was actually worse, because lost meant someone inside the chain had made an error, and errors drew attention. Choi Sung-woo was explaining the backup options. "We reroute through the northern passage," he said, pulling up a map on the screen mounted at the far wall. He pointed. "It adds 4 days but the risk exposure is lower. The northern passage is monitored more heavily since last October," said another man, a younger one near the end of the table whose name was Lim Jae-ho. "We tried it once before and..." "That was different circumstances," Sung-woo said, cutting him off. "The monitoring increased because of a separate incident that has since been resolved. It's clear now." Lim Jae-ho didn't look convinced but he didn't push. Dahun nodded slowly. "The northern passage makes sense. It connects to the existing relay point in Busan. From there it's standard. And then a voice spoke. It was quiet. Measured. It did not announce itself. It simply entered the conversation the way a current enters water, naturally, without disturbance, but with clear and definite direction. The northern passage isn't clear, Naledi said. The room stopped. Every head turned toward her. She had not moved from where she stood. She was still in the same position, same posture, hands still folded. But she had spoken, and the words had the weight of someone who was not guessing. Sung-woo stared at her for a moment. Then he exhaled slowly through his nose and looked at Seon-hyuk, as if asking permission to be annoyed. Seon-hyuk said nothing. He was watching Naledi with the particular kind of attention he gave to things he found interesting. Sung-woo turned back to Naledi. "I'm sorry," he said, and the two words carried a wall of cold condescension inside them. "The northern passage," she said again, calmly. "It was cleared operationally, yes. But there was a customs agreement signed between the South Korean Maritime Authority and the Japanese Coast Guard in January. It expanded joint surveillance protocols in that exact corridor. It hasn't been publicly reported yet, the formal implementation starts in March, but the pre-deployment equipment has been active since last month." Silence. The kind that is different from the silence before. This silence was not empty. It was full of something: confusion, recalculation, and the specific discomfort of people who have just realized that someone they dismissed knows more than they do. Sung-woo's mouth was slightly open. Lim Jae-ho, who had just been overruled by Sung-woo moments before, was now looking at Naledi with wide eyes and something that was edging slowly toward respect. Daehoon had gone very still. "How would you know that?" Sung-woo asked. His tone was still controlled, but the certainty had leaked out of it. Naledi looked at him without blinking. She did not explain herself. She did not offer a source. She did not soften her answer to make it more comfortable to receive. "Because I read," she said. And then she was quiet again. Seon-hyuk, for just a fraction of a second, allowed the corner of his mouth to shift. Not quite a smile. Something close to one. Then it was gone, and his face returned to its usual stillness. The room did not recover its previous rhythm. Men who had been leaning back in their chairs had straightened up. Papers were being looked at again but not read, eyes moving without taking anything in, minds working on a different problem now. The problem of who this woman was and why they had been so quick to dismiss her. But Daehoon was not ready to let go. He was a man who had spent 30 years being the loudest, most established voice in rooms like this one. He had dealt with rivals and threats and shifting power, and he had done it by never letting a crack show. And this woman who had no seat, who had said nothing for 40 minutes, who had stood there like furniture while they talked around her, had just quietly dismantled Sung-woo's entire argument in 2 sentences. That was not something Daehoon could absorb without pushing back. He looked at her across the table, and his voice came out slow and deliberate, like each word was being placed with the intention of damage. "Interesting theory," he said. "But we don't make decisions in this room based on things people overheard or read somewhere." He paused. "Especially people who weren't invited." The words landed. Choi Sung-woo looked down. Lim Jae-ho looked at the wall. The 2 men by the door had gone completely rigid. And the room went so quiet that the low hum of the air conditioning above became the loudest sound in the building. Naledi did not blink. She did not move. She held Daehoon's gaze as if she were watching someone who had just made a move in a game they didn't understand they were playing, and she was simply waiting for them to realize it. And then, finally, Seon-hyuk spoke. It wasn't loud. It wasn't harsh. It was the same quiet, controlled voice he always used, the voice that made people lean forward slightly because it never performed and yet commanded complete attention. He did not look at Daehoon when he spoke. He looked at Naledi. "What do you think we should do about the deal?" he asked. 5 seconds of silence that felt like 5 minutes. Because it wasn't just the question. It was the way he asked it. The tone of it. The complete absence of performance in it. He wasn't asking a subordinate for a report. He wasn't asking an assistant to summarize notes. He was asking the way you ask someone you trust completely, someone whose answer you are going to take seriously regardless of what anyone else in the room thinks. The same way you'd ask a partner. Or an equal. Or someone who knows more than you and you know it. Everyone in the room felt that distinction in their chests like a change in pressure. Naledi took a breath. Not from nerves, from the particular kind of focus that precedes clarity. "The northern and southern routes are both compromised in different ways," she said. "The northern passage has the surveillance issue I mentioned. The southern route, the original one, was compromised because someone in the relay chain didn't follow the timing protocol. Not because the route itself is exposed." She paused, letting that land. "The route is fine. The people running it need to be restructured. Specifically, the relay point in the middle needs to change hands. The person currently managing it has been inconsistent for the past 8 months. 2 shipments were delayed under his watch, this lost one is the 3rd. Replace that role, restore the timing protocol, and the southern route becomes the safest option again." She stopped. No flourish. No performance. Just the answer, clean and complete. The room stayed silent. Lim Jae-ho was staring at her openly now, not bothering to hide it. Sung-woo had his hand flat on the table, pressing down slightly as if he needed something solid to hold on to. 3 other men were looking at their documents, not reading them, just needing somewhere to point their eyes while their minds recalibrated. Dahun was completely still. He looked like a man who had walked into a wall he hadn't seen. Seon-hyuk nodded once. Slowly. "That matches what I concluded last week," he said. Then he looked at the room. "Are there other opinions?" Nobody offered one. The meeting moved forward, but it was a different meeting now. The men spoke more carefully. They measured their words. And when they referenced the route, they referenced it in the way Nality had framed it, as a personnel problem, not a logistics problem. Nobody said out loud that they had adopted her framework. But they had, and everyone in the room knew it. Dahun spoke less in the second half of the meeting than he had in the first. When he did speak, his voice had lost the theatrical confidence it carried before. He sounded like a man who was still performing, but who had forgotten the words to part of his lines. Nality answered 2 more questions, both directed at her by Seon-hyuk, and both times she answered with the same clean precision. No emotion. No evidence of the tension that had preceded each question. She spoke like someone for whom this conversation was simply what conversations were. By the time the meeting neared its end, the mocking energy that had filled the room an hour ago had been quietly, completely, surgically removed from the air. Replaced by something the men were still trying to name. It sat somewhere between confusion and the specific discomfort of a mistake you can't take back. The reveal came the way real reveals come, not as a dramatic announcement, but as information given quietly, to a room that had finally become still enough to receive it. Seon-hyuk closed the folder in front of him. He leaned back in his chair. And he looked around the table slowly, the way he did when he wanted people to understand that what he was about to say was not a story, it was a correction of record. "Before we close," he said, "I want to address something." He didn't gesture at Nality. He didn't need to. Every eye in the room had been orbiting her for the last hour. "Some of you treated the person standing beside me as though she were a mistake in the room," he said. "As though she were here by accident. Or for decoration. Or as someone who needed to be managed or removed." No one moved. "I want to clarify who she is," he continued. "Not because she needs you to know. She doesn't. But because I need you to be operating with accurate information in order to do your jobs correctly." He paused. The silence in the room was absolute. "Nality Abra has been part of this operation for 6 years," he said. "She came in when we were trying to expand into the African routes, specifically the eastern and southern corridors. We had no contacts. No infrastructure. No understanding of how the distribution networks worked on the ground in those regions." He let that sit for a moment. "She built it," he said simply. "Every contact we have in that region exists because of her. The eastern corridor that moves 40% of our total volume, she negotiated that from scratch. Twice. Because the first agreement collapsed, and instead of walking away, she went back and rebuilt it on better terms." He looked at Dahun when he said the next part. "The deal that put this operation into a different financial category 3 years ago, the one that allowed us to restructure entirely and clear the debts from the previous regime, that deal happened because she identified the window, wrote the strategy, and executed it while I was handling a situation in Busan that required my full attention." Dahun's jaw had tightened. He was looking at the table. "She is not a bodyguard," Seon-hyuk continued. "She is not a servant. She is not someone I am temporarily entertaining." He said the last phrase without emphasis, but the precision with which he chose it made it clear he had heard exactly what Dahun said earlier and had been holding it this entire time, like a card he was choosing the right moment to play. "She is the only person in my operation whose judgment I trust completely on matters of route strategy, deal structure, and risk assessment. She is the reason several of you still have functioning networks instead of problems you'd be trying to explain to people who are not as patient as I am." He did not raise his voice once. He didn't need to. "So when she speaks in this room," he said, looking around the table slowly, making eye contact for a precise moment with each person, "you will treat it the way you would treat my words. Not out of courtesy. Out of accuracy. Because her judgment has earned that place, and it did so long before any of you were in this room." He picked up his pen. "That's all. We're done for tonight." The meeting broke the way a storm breaks, suddenly, with a kind of emptiness where the pressure used to be. Men gathered their papers and phones with the quiet urgency of people who wanted to leave a room as quickly as possible without looking like they were running from it. Conversations that would usually linger, the post-meeting murmuring, the side deals, the casual political maneuvering that happened in the 30 minutes after the formal business ended, none of that happened. People moved toward the door with their eyes down. Dahun was the third to leave. He walked past Nality on his way out and stopped for a fraction of a second, not long enough to be a real pause, but long enough for Nality to notice. He did not apologize. Men like Dahun rarely did, not directly. But he gave a short, stiff nod before he continued walking. Naledi received it without expression. Choi Sung-woo paused at the door. He turned back and looked at her for a moment, then at the table, then back at her. The surveillance information, he said quietly. About the January agreement. We hadn't heard that. I know, she said. He nodded slowly. Not with the hollow politeness of someone going through emotion. With the genuine acknowledgement of someone recalibrating. Then he left. Lim Jae-ho was the last to go. He was young, late 20s, relatively new to this world, and he looked at Naledi with something different from the others. Not guilt, exactly. More like the expression of someone who had thought they were learning how this world worked and had just discovered they were still in the early chapters. I didn't say anything, he said quietly. When they were talking to you. I should have. Naledi looked at him. Focus on your section of the route, she said. Get the timing protocol right and you'll have less to worry about than anyone else in that room. He blinked. Then he nodded, and something in his posture shifted, stood slightly straighter, as he walked out. The room was empty now except for Seon-hyuk and Naledi. Seon-hyuk was standing, gathering the last of his materials. He didn't say anything for a minute. The silence between them was not the tense kind. It was the kind that only exists between people who have spent enough time together that words are not always necessary. You let it go on longer than I expected, Naledi said. Seon-hyuk looked up. Longer than you expected, or longer than you would have preferred? Both. He almost smiled. I needed them to see it, he said. Not just hear it. If I had corrected it in the first 10 minutes, they would have been careful for the rest of the meeting. Politically careful. They would have treated you differently on the outside and thought exactly the same things on the inside. Naledi was quiet for a moment, considering this. Letting them expose themselves completely, he continued, means the correction they experienced tonight was real. They can't unsee what they saw. They can't unfeel the moment the room shifted. That kind of learning stays. And if I hadn't wanted to be the instrument of their lesson, she asked. The question wasn't angry. It was honest. Seon-hyuk looked at her directly. Then you would have told me beforehand, he said. The way you always do. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she picked up her small notebook from the side table where she had placed it when they first walked in. The relay point change needs to happen within 3 weeks, she said. If it goes longer, the southern route becomes unstable again for different reasons. The contacts I have on that side are patient, but they don't wait indefinitely. I know, he said. I'll have Hyun-soo draft the transition by Friday. Have him send it to me first, she said. I always do. They took the elevator down together in silence, and then walked out through the building's private exit, which led out onto a smaller street that ran parallel to the main boulevard. The night air in Gangnam was cool and carried the faint smell of rain that hadn't fallen yet. The city hummed around them, distant traffic, the low rhythm of a night city finding its pace, towers of glass and light stacked against a dark sky. There was a terrace on the side of the building, a narrow outdoor platform meant for maintenance access that had, over the years of Seon-hyuk using this building, become a place where the two of them ended up after meetings. It looked over the city from a precise angle that cut between two larger towers and showed you the skyline in a way most of the city's residents never saw. They stood there now. Below, a small figure moved along the pavement, one of the men from the meeting, Naledi thought, though she couldn't be certain at this distance. The figure paused at the corner and looked up once, briefly, at the building before disappearing around it. That was Dehun, Seon-hyuk said quietly. Naledi looked at the empty corner. He's trying to understand what happened tonight. He will for a long time. He won't change, she said. It wasn't pessimistic. Just factual. Men like him don't change what they think. They just learn to hide it better. Maybe, Seon-hyuk said. But he'll work correctly. That's what matters in that room. Naledi was quiet. She looked out at the skyline, the towers glittering, the spaces between them deep and dark, the way a city always contains both its brightness and its shadows at the same time, occupying the same space without canceling each other out. You know what I think about sometimes, she said. He waited. The first meeting, she said. That small office in Gaborone. You came with 2 people and a proposal that had 3 mistakes in the numbers. Seon-hyuk exhaled slowly through his nose, a quiet sound, almost like the beginning of a laugh that hadn't committed to itself. I know, he said. I almost left, she said. I know that too. But the idea was right, she continued. The numbers were wrong, but the idea was right. And you knew you didn't know what you didn't know. That was unusual. She paused. Most people who come into a room thinking they have the answer get irritated when someone points out what they missed. You got quiet. You went still and you listened. I was 26, he said. I couldn't afford not to listen. Most people that age can't afford it either, she said. They just don't know it yet. He nodded. Below them, the city moved on in its usual patterns, indifferent to the meeting that had just occurred on the 14th floor, indifferent to the lesson that had been quietly administered to 9 men in a dark room by a woman who had never raised her voice. They always underestimate the quiet ones, Seon-hyuk said. His voice had gone lower, the way it did when he was saying something he had been thinking for a while. The ones who build things without announcing that they're building them. The ones who are already 3 conversations ahead before anyone has finished the first sentence. He looked out at the skyline. People want to see the performance. They forget that the people who know the most rarely have any reason to perform. Naledi didn't respond immediately. She looked at the city for a long time, at the lights that never fully went dark, at the towers that stood because of countless invisible people who had laid their foundations and walked away without a monument. People always underestimate the ones who built everything quietly, she said softly. The words came naturally. Not as a motto or a declaration. Just as truth, spoken simply, the way real truths tend to be, without drama, without announcement, without the need for an audience. Sean Hyuk looked at her briefly. The city reflected faintly in his dark eyes. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Not because anyone in that room had finally decided she was worthy of respect. But because she had always been worthy of it, long before that room existed. Comment below, where are you watching from? And subscribe if you're new here. And tell me, if you were in Naledi's position, would you have stayed calm or spoken up?